Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. Beijing is sending a very clear message today across the strategic board. Its nuclear posture is getting harder to hit. Its economic pressure campaign is getting harder for Europe to absorb. And its regional claims are getting louder at sea. The top story is China's massive buildout in the northwestern desert near the Hami nuclear missile silo field. Satellite imagery reviewed by Reuters shows more than 80 launch pads, bunkers, railheads, airfields, communications nodes, and 3 octagon-shaped installations spread across thousands of square kilometers. This is not just China pouring concrete in the desert for fun. Analysts looking at the imagery say the infrastructure could support mobile missile launchers, air defense systems, electronic warfare nodes, satellite communications, and command and control activity. The strategic point is survivability. China already has missiles that can reach the U.S. What this build-out appears to do is make those forces harder to neutralize in a crisis. If the Hami silo field is the crown jewel of China's land-based nuclear force, these new facilities look like the security system, the backup generator, the decoy network, and the getaway route all rolled into one. Beijing is building a structure that complicates U.S. planning and reinforces China's ability to retaliate if it is ever struck first. The two most developed Octagon facilities sit roughly 140 and 230 kilometers southwest of the Hami field. Imagery shows housing for personnel, areas for large military vehicles, armored bunkers, fortified storage sites, airfield support, rail links, access roads, and possible fuel storage. Recent imagery from April 30th and May 11th showed vehicle tracks, temporary structures, and camouflaged military vehicles near the northern octagon. That suggests these sites are not just static architecture. They appear to be part of a more flexible operating model for China's nuclear forces. This is where the bigger strategic concern kicks in. China still says it maintains a no first-use nuclear policy, but its physical posture is becoming more sophisticated and more survivable. The Pentagon assessment cited in the reporting says China is on track to field 1,000 warheads by 2030 and likely has already loaded 100 ICBMs across its 3 main silo fields. China is also improving early warning through Huoyan-1 satellites, which U.S. officials say could detect an incoming ICBM within 90 seconds and alert a command center within 3 to 4 minutes. That is a much faster nuclear decision cycle. And faster decision cycles are not exactly a spa day for crisis stability. Europe is the next major front, and the story here is economic security with sharp elbows. On May 29th, European commissioners debated new ways to shield European industries from surging Chinese imports and reduce dependence on Chinese inputs and critical minerals. The options under review include forcing companies to diversify supply chains, creating new trade tools, and applying import duties and quotas more systematically across sectors like chemicals, metals, clean technology, and critical minerals. This is an update on a theme listeners have heard before, but today's details show Europe moving from complaint mode into tool-building mode. The EU is trying to protect its industrial base before Chinese overcapacity hollows out politically sensitive sectors. Electric vehicles are the most visible example, but this is broader than cars. It touches steel, solar, clean tech, chemicals, batteries, and rare earth supply chains. The 2025 EU goods deficit with China was about $418 billion, and early 2026 trade data pointed to a record imbalance. That is the kind of number that makes finance ministers reach for the espresso and industry ministers start sounding like national security officials. The EV piece is especially tricky. Europe imposed tariffs on subsidized Chinese electric vehicles, but hybrid models were not covered. Hybrids now account for nearly 40% of new car registrations this year, while China's market share in Europe continues to rise. That means Brussels tried to close the front door, and Chinese competition is still finding the side entrance. Not illegal, not surprising, but definitely annoying if you are a European automaker trying to keep factories open in Germany, France, Spain, or Italy. Beijing is responding in classic form: deny the premise, threaten retaliation, and remind everyone it has leverage. Chinese officials accuse the EU of selectively using trade data to justify imbalance claims. Chinese state-linked messaging warned that Europe's proposed overcapacity instrument could trigger anti-discrimination and supply chain security investigations. Beijing has also warned against buy European and technology sovereignty policies. The message is pretty straightforward. Europe can try to build a shield, but China wants the price of that shield to feel expensive. Underneath the trade dispute is a quieter but very important intelligence story: logistics data. Jamestown's reporting on LogInc, Alibaba's Cainiao, and the EWTP initiative points to a Chinese ecosystem that is shaping global trade standards around customs clearance, logistics visibility, and data control. Cainiao's overseas network includes warehouses, logistics hubs, and processing centers across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Western Hemisphere. LogInc collects cargo tracking, customs clearance information, corporate registry data, billing and payment records, and geolocation data. That may sound like paperwork with a passport, but it matters. If Chinese-linked platforms become embedded in global shipping, Beijing gains visibility into supply chains even when Chinese companies do not own the cargo or operate the port. That helps identify choke points, dependencies, sanctions vulnerabilities, and routes around trade controls. Critical minerals, energy, food, defense inputs, dual-use tech. This is the bloodstream of modern power. It is not flashy, there is no Marvel soundtrack, but for intelligence and economic statecraft, that kind of data is extremely valuable. At sea, Beijing is also maintaining pressure around Taiwan and the South China Sea. China objected to the Canadian frigate HMCS Charlottetown transiting the Taiwan Strait last week, saying it opposes countries using freedom of navigation to undermine Chinese sovereignty. Taiwan responded that the strait is an international waterway and that all countries enjoy freedom of navigation. This is not a new argument, but the tempo matters. Every transit becomes a political signal. Every Chinese objection becomes part of Beijing's effort to frame the strait as a sovereignty issue rather than a global waterway. China also told Taiwan not to interfere with Chinese Air Force missions around the island, saying its aircraft are operating in Chinese airspace. Taiwan has reported Chinese joint combat readiness patrols, published images of Chinese warships and fighters, and noted more than 100 Chinese ships operating up and down the first island chain, from Japan past Taiwan and into the Philippines. The strategic issue is normalization. Beijing wants a constant presence around Taiwan to become the background noise of the region, the thing everyone just learns to live with. That is the danger. The South China Sea saw another flashpoint, this time involving the Dutch frigate HNLMS De Ruyter near the Paracel Islands. China says the ship entered waters it claims and that its NH-90 helicopter violated Chinese airspace. The PLA Southern Theater Command said it used verbal warnings and electronic jamming to push the vessel away. Chinese state media added that Type 056A and Type 054A frigates were involved, along with fighters carrying PL-10 air-to-air missiles. The Netherlands denied entering territorial waters and said the ship was operating under international law. The larger point is that European navies are now showing up in places Beijing wants to treat as its own private security zone, and China is making clear it does not plan to shrug that off. China is also dialing down senior-level defense diplomacy at a moment when it would probably be useful. Defense Minister Dong Jun will skip the Shangri-La dialogue for the second straight year. Instead, Beijing is sending PLA-affiliated experts, scholars, and Navy personnel. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is scheduled to speak, and the Chinese delegation will likely face questions about whether corruption purges are affecting PLA readiness. Reuters reported that former defense ministers Wei Fenghe and Li Shangfu were sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve earlier this month. That is not exactly the personnel management section of a normal defense newsletter. It raises real questions about trust, discipline, and command climate inside the PLA. China's domestic security services are also widening the definition of sensitive data. The Ministry of State Security warned that small meteorological devices could become digital dark sentinels if they upload real-time weather and geolocation data to overseas platforms. State media described 2 cases involving Chinese citizens whose devices synced information with foreign-linked apps or websites, including one rooftop station near a militarily sensitive area. Beijing is basically telling the public that even a hobby weather station can become an intelligence problem. That fits the broader pattern. The Chinese state increasingly treats data as a security asset first and a civilian convenience second. Finally, in the Philippines, 64 Chinese citizens detained at a steel plant in Misamis Oriental were released after authorities found insufficient evidence for allegations involving nuclear safety, immigration, and labor law violations. Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro had called for a full probe into an operation involving undocumented foreign nationals and potentially hazardous materials. China said it lodged repeated, stern representations, and 6 more Chinese citizens were still going through release procedures. On its own, this is a local industrial and legal case. In the current Indo-Pacific climate, though, even a steel plant dispute can become a diplomatic tripwire. Thank you for listening and for contributing to the growth of this community. If you found the show valuable, a review or a thoughtful comment helps extend its reach to others. For more in-depth analysis, we publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, covering Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Take care and have a great day.